Hunger was no longer an event or a temporary hardship. It had settled into daily life with the quiet authority of something permanent. It shaped the rhythm of mornings and the calculations of evenings, determining how far a person could walk, how long they could stand, and how much energy they could afford to spend on hope. Meals were no longer anticipated with pleasure but approached with strategy, as if eating itself had become a form of rationed labor. In homes across the region, cupboards stood half-empty not because of neglect, but because scarcity had outpaced every effort to prepare. People spoke less about food than they once had, not because it mattered less, but because speaking about it only sharpened the pain of its absence. The war had done this gradually, almost methodically. First came shortages that could be explained, supply lines disrupted, harvests requisitioned, transport diverted to the front. Then came rationing, which at first carried the promise of fairness, of order imposed on chaos. Over time, that promise eroded. Rations shrank, quality declined, and rules bent in favor of those with access or authority. What remained was an uneven landscape of survival, where some endured on scraps while others, visibly and unmistakably, did not. Hunger became a social divider as much as a physical one, quietly reorganizing communities along lines of access and power. For civilians caught within this system, the future narrowed. Long-term thinking felt indulgent when the present demanded constant negotiation with weakness and fatigue. Parents learned to eat less so children could eat something. Elderly relatives became silent measures of decline, their frailty accelerated by the steady absence of nourishment. The body adapted in small, troubling ways. Slower movements, dulled concentration, a persistent cold that no season seemed to explain. These changes were noticed, but rarely discussed openly. To acknowledge them too directly felt like conceding defeat. Against this backdrop, the movement of soldiers through the area was met with a complicated mix of fear, resentment, and resignation. Uniforms had come to signify authority imposed from elsewhere, decisions made far beyond the reach of those who would live with their consequences. Armies passed through landscapes like weather systems, altering conditions without regard for individual lives beneath them. Civilians had learned to watch from a distance, to avoid drawing attention, to interpret survival as invisibility. Soldiers meant requisitions, restrictions, and the quiet threat of punishment for those who crossed invisible lines. British soldiers, when they arrived, were not immediately distinguished from other forces in the civilian imagination. Their language, accents, and insignia mattered less than the fact that they carried weapons and operated according to military necessity. People assumed, almost instinctively, that these men would consume their supplies among themselves, guarding them carefully in a world where food equaled endurance and endurance equaled advantage. The civilians' own hunger sharpened this assumption. It was easier to believe that scarcity applied only to the powerless. The sight of military provisions triggered conflicting reactions. On one level, it reinforced the injustice of the situation, proof that food existed, that scarcity was not universal but selectively experienced. On another level, it was simply painful to witness. The smell of cooked meals carried farther than expected, cutting through the air with an intimacy that felt almost cruel. It reminded people not just of what they lacked, but of what they remembered: full meals, shared tables, the ordinary comfort of eating without fear that tomorrow would be worse. Yet despite this, the civilians did not rush forward or demand anything. Years of war had taught them restraint. Approaching soldiers uninvited carried risks, and hope, when misplaced, could be dangerous. There was also a deeper psychological barrier at work: the belief that food shared by soldiers was not meant for them, that such boundaries were fixed and unyielding. Hunger had trained people not only to endure deprivation, but to internalize it as normal. As the soldiers settled, their routines unfolded in plain view. They prepared meals with practiced efficiency, unpacking supplies that seemed carefully organized and plentiful by civilian standards. There was no visible panic in their movements, no sense of urgency that suggested tomorrow's food was uncertain. This calm, more than the food itself, created a subtle tension. It suggested a world governed by different rules, one where hunger was a challenge to be managed rather than a fate to be endured. The civilians watched closely, though often from the edges, doorways, windows, the far side of open ground. Observation became a form of participation that required no risk. In these moments, people compared the soldiers' posture, their pace, their apparent energy, with their own diminished state. The contrast was undeniable, but it did not immediately provoke anger. Instead, it produced a quieter, more unsettling reaction: confusion. If scarcity was the defining condition of the war, how could it fail to touch everyone equally? This question lingered unspoken. People had learned that asking such questions rarely produced answers and often produced consequences. Instead, they absorbed the scene silently, adding it to a growing internal archive of contradictions. The war, they knew, was full of them. Grand declarations about sacrifice existed alongside clear hierarchies of who was expected to sacrifice most. Appeals to unity coexisted with systems that rewarded some lives more generously than others. What the civilians did not yet know was that this moment would disrupt those assumptions in an unexpected way. At this early stage, there was no anticipation of kindness, no expectation of moral deviation from the patterns established by years of conflict. The prevailing belief was simple and deeply ingrained: hunger would continue, because nothing in recent memory suggested otherwise. Watching soldiers eat did not feel like a prelude to relief. It felt like confirmation of a truth they had already accepted: that survival in wartime was unevenly distributed and rarely questioned by those on the favorable side of that divide. And so they waited, not with hope, but with endurance. Hunger had taught them that waiting was safer than asking, observing safer than approaching, and silence safer than belief. The soldiers, for now, were just another presence in a long procession of forces passing through their lives. No one yet imagined that this ordinary, almost routine scene, men in uniform eating their rations, was about to fracture a certainty that hunger had spent years carefully building. From the moment the soldiers began to eat, the act itself became a spectacle, not because it was loud or deliberate, but because it unfolded in plain sight. In a world where hunger had forced meals into secrecy and improvisation, the openness of the scene felt almost foreign. Pots were set down without haste, tins opened without calculation, bread broken without ceremony. Nothing about it suggested urgency or fear of shortage. The soldiers behaved as though the next meal was already accounted for, as though eating was a routine rather than a strategic decision. For those watching, this calm carried a quiet provocation. The civilians observed carefully, measuring every movement against their own lived experience. They noticed that the soldiers did not scan their surroundings anxiously, did not shield their food from view, did not rush to consume everything as quickly as possible. Instead, they talked casually among themselves, pausing between bites, allowing food to cool rather than swallowing it immediately. These details, insignificant in ordinary times, stood out sharply against a background where every crumb was normally treated as urgent and precious. The contrast was unsettling precisely because it exposed how deeply hunger had reshaped civilian behavior. Distance played a crucial role. Most civilians kept themselves far enough away to avoid attention, yet close enough to see clearly. This distance was not merely physical, it was psychological. Years of conflict had taught them that approaching soldiers invited scrutiny, and scrutiny could easily become danger. Even when no explicit threat was present, caution had become instinct. Hunger might weaken the body, but fear sharpened the mind. People watched from behind fences, from the corners of damaged buildings, from open fields where they could retreat quickly if needed. As the soldiers ate, the smell of food drifted outward, carried by air currents that ignored the invisible boundaries between military and civilian worlds. It was not a single scent but many layered together: warm bread, cooked meat, something metallic from open tins. For some, the smell triggered memories more than appetite. Kitchens before the war, family gatherings, meals that marked time rather than survival. These memories were painful not because they were gone, but because they now felt incompatible with the present. The smell was a reminder of a normality that no longer seemed to belong to them. Yet the civilians did not react outwardly. There were no raised voices, no visible protests, no pleading gestures. Hunger had stripped away the illusion that desperation alone could produce generosity. Experience suggested the opposite. that desperation often hardened boundaries rather than softened them. To approach openly would have required not just courage, but a belief that the outcome could be different from every prior encounter with armed authority. Most were not ready to believe that. Instead, people watched for patterns. They noticed how food was distributed among the soldiers themselves, whether rank influenced portion size, whether some were excluded. What they saw did not align with their expectations. There was structure, but not visible hoarding. No one seemed to be guarding their share with suspicion. Extra items were set aside casually, not immediately consumed or hidden. This behavior unsettled assumptions that had formed under prolonged scarcity, where every surplus had to be protected or it would be lost. Children, when present, were often the first to stare openly. Too young to fully internalize caution, they watched with a mix of curiosity and longing that adults tried to mask. Parents redirected their gaze, not wanting that curiosity to be noticed by soldiers, nor wanting children to imagine possibilities that could not be fulfilled. Hunger, after all, had taught adults that unfulfilled hope could wound more deeply than hunger itself. The soldiers' demeanor remained consistent. There was no theatrical generosity, no exaggerated displays meant to be noticed. If anything, their eating appeared deliberately unremarkable, as though they were unaware of the attention they were receiving. This lack of performance was itself confusing. Civilians were accustomed to power announcing itself clearly, often loudly. Here, power existed quietly, expressed through ease rather than force. The soldiers' indifference to being watched suggested that they did not see the civilians as a threat or as a resource to be managed. This dynamic created an emotional tension that was difficult to name. The civilians felt neither anger nor gratitude, but something closer to disorientation. They had prepared themselves emotionally for indifference or hostility, not for this calm neutrality. The presence of food, unguarded and unhidden, created a sense of suspended expectation. Nothing was happening, yet the possibility that something could happen hovered uncomfortably in the air. As time passed, small details began to stand out. A soldier wiped his hands and left part of his portion untouched. Another offered a piece of bread to a fellow soldier who declined without urgency. There was no visible scarcity within the group, no sense that sharing internally would lead to later deprivation. These gestures, observed from afar, challenged a deeply ingrained belief that in wartime, abundance was always temporary and therefore always jealously guarded. For civilians, this belief had been reinforced by years of lived experience. Any moment of relative plenty was followed by loss. Any relaxation of vigilance led to regret. Hunger had not only thinned bodies but narrowed emotional range, encouraging suspicion as a survival tool. Watching the soldiers ignore these rules felt almost reckless. It raised the unsettling possibility that the rules themselves might not be universal. Despite this, no one moved closer. The idea that soldiers might share food had not yet taken shape. The civilians' frame of reference did not include such an outcome. Previous encounters with armed forces had established a consistent pattern. Food moved inward, toward the uniformed, away from the civilian. Even when aid existed, it was mediated through systems, paperwork, and conditions that made it feel abstract and distant. Spontaneous generosity, especially across such a stark power divide, felt implausible. The watching continued, stretching from minutes into longer spans of time. Hunger sharpened awareness, making each second feel extended. The civilians noticed when the soldiers finished eating, when they cleaned their utensils, when they prepared to move on or settle in. Still, there was no sign of concealment, no immediate packing away of leftovers. The absence of urgency persisted, reinforcing the sense that these men were operating under a different relationship with scarcity. This realization did not yet inspire hope, but it planted doubt. Doubt in the idea that hunger was an immutable condition, imposed equally by war on all who lived within it. Doubt in the assumption that those with power would always choose to exercise it in the same predictable ways. For people who had survived by assuming the worst, this doubt was uncomfortable. It destabilized the emotional defenses they had built to endure deprivation. As the scene unfolded without resolution, the civilians remained in place, suspended between resignation and curiosity. They did not yet know that what they were witnessing was the early stage of a moral reversal, one that would challenge not only their expectations of soldiers, but their understanding of what was possible even in the midst of war. For now, all they could do was watch, hungry and uncertain, as a simple act, eating without fear, quietly disrupted the logic that hunger had imposed on their lives. The first signs of something shifting came so quietly that they might have been missed by anyone not watching closely. At first, it was a subtle difference in the way the soldiers handled their food, an action here, a glance there, a pause where once there had been none. These small variations began to accumulate, and with them, a strange sense of discomfort grew in the watching civilians. This discomfort was not rooted in the obvious disparity of food between them and the soldiers, but in the unsettling realization that what they had assumed to be an unchangeable dynamic was now being questioned. The soldiers' behavior remained outwardly consistent with the routines of military life, yet certain moments offered hints that not all was as it seemed. A soldier, perhaps unconsciously, set aside a portion of his bread, leaving it on the side of his plate as if he had no immediate intention of eating it. Another soldier reached for a tin of beans, only to hand it to a comrade with a nod, as if acknowledging some unspoken rule about sharing. These seemingly insignificant acts triggered an internal shift in the civilians watching, though they could not yet identify exactly why. The soldiers were still in uniform, still distant in their roles as occupiers, but something had subtly altered. For years, the civilians had lived with the understanding that hunger was a law they all followed equally, with few exceptions. They had grown accustomed to seeing hunger as something that defined their lives, something that shaped their identity. But now, in the space of a few moments, a new possibility had entered their minds. Could it be that hunger did not have to be a condition that everyone suffered equally? Could some be exempt from its grasp not because of power or privilege, but because of something else, something that had not yet fully revealed itself? It was not that the soldiers were overtly generous at this point. There were no grand gestures of charity, no speeches about shared hardship or solidarity. The sharing was small, almost incidental, and yet it was there, undeniable. A soldier offered the leftover piece of bread to a companion, who accepted it with a quiet thanks. Another soldier, having finished his meal, casually offered the remainder of his rations to the group. These small exchanges were not framed by any formal expectations of charity. They did not carry the usual markers of intentional kindness or philanthropy. They were simply actions that suggested a relationship with food, and with each other, that was not governed by the normal rules of survival. The civilians watching from the distance had become acutely aware of this shift, and though no one spoke of it, the effect was palpable. A strange kind of tension hung in the air, as if the very act of witnessing this behavior might somehow alter the rules of engagement. The soldiers did not seem to care whether they were being observed, and the civilians, in turn, found themselves caught in a liminal space between disbelief and confusion. They were watching soldiers, representatives of power, of authority, of scarcity, display behaviors that suggested generosity without expectation, equality without demand. The moment was jarring, for it contradicted everything they had come to believe about the nature of war, power, and hunger. For many of the civilians, hunger had been a steady, reliable force that shaped the contours of their existence. They had learned to live with it as an unspoken companion, a part of life that no one questioned. There was a tacit understanding that if you had food, you protected it, because tomorrow could very well bring a time when there would be none. Scarcity was a constant state, an ever-present backdrop against which everything else played out. In this world, food was not just sustenance. It was currency, power, survival. And yet, here were these soldiers, who, by all outward appearances, should have been hoarding, should have been guarding their supplies for their own benefit, doing the opposite. They seemed to have no fear that their portion would disappear, no sense of urgency that the next meal might be their last. This quiet defiance of hunger's rules was not lost on those observing from the distance. It was the kind of thing that made people question their own assumptions, their own behaviors, their own ways of thinking. For so long, civilians had assumed that scarcity was a zero-sum game, that survival required vigilance and self-preservation above all else. Now, watching the soldiers, they began to wonder whether that assumption was true. Could there be a world where food could be shared without fear of reprisal? Could generosity exist even in the harshest conditions? The civilians' emotional responses began to evolve. What had started as confusion began to deepen into something more complex, an unsettling mixture of hope and fear. Hope, because the soldiers' behavior hinted at the possibility that the laws of hunger might not be as absolute as they had always believed. And fear, because this hope threatened to shatter the very framework that had allowed them to endure so much. If hunger could be defied, then what did that mean for the world they had lived in for so long? What did it mean for the power dynamics that had been established, for the ways in which they had learned to survive? At first, no one dared to make a move. People continued to watch from their windows, from behind corners, from the cover of buildings, as the soldiers continued their quiet acts of sharing. There was something deeply disorienting about the scene, something that felt almost too fragile to believe. It was as if, by acknowledging the possibility that food could be shared without strings attached, the civilians might open a door to a new kind of reality, one that they weren't sure they were ready for. The weight of the years spent in survival mode, in a world where scarcity ruled, pressed heavily on their shoulders. It was easier to believe that nothing would change, that the soldiers were merely a fleeting presence in their lives, just another force to endure, another system to survive. But as the moments passed, the civilians began to notice more. The soldiers did not seem to be watching the civilians, did not seem to be concerned about who was watching them. They ate as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if they had nothing to hide. There was no tension in their movements, no sign of reluctance in their eyes. And the more the civilians watched, the more they began to feel something shift within themselves, something they could not easily name. It was as though the very act of witnessing this simple exchange, of watching men share bread without reservation, was beginning to crack open a possibility that had been previously unimaginable. In that moment, something fundamental began to change within the civilians. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that the rules they had internalized about hunger, about scarcity, about survival, might not be universal. They might not be the inevitable constants they had believed them to be. In the presence of these soldiers, they were being forced to reconsider everything they had assumed about power, generosity, and the possibility of survival without fear. What had seemed impossible, an occupation force willingly sharing resources, had cracked open a small, fragile window through which hope might begin to seep. And yet, despite the emotional stirrings this provoked, no one moved forward. The soldiers did not beckon, did not invite. The civilians remained where they were, uncertain, afraid to risk the potential disappointment of believing in something they could not yet understand. They had learned the hard way that hope, when unearned, could be just as cruel as hunger itself. So they watched and waited, and wondered if this strange, fragile moment would pass, or if it would bloom into something far more significant than they were prepared to face. The shift, when it finally came, was almost imperceptible at first. A small gesture here, a quiet offering there, but the cumulative effect of these subtle actions began to break down the walls of expectation that had stood so long between civilians and soldiers. The moment that marked the beginning of a change was not heralded by dramatic words or a sudden display of generosity. Rather, it occurred quietly, with a calm that stood in stark contrast to the frantic tension of wartime. The soldiers, once indifferent to the suffering of those around them, began to act in ways that suggested something more than mere occupation. It began when one soldier, having finished his meal, glanced around the circle, then looked directly at a civilian who had been watching from behind a wall. Without a word, he took the last piece of his bread and pushed it in the direction of the civilian. At first, the action seemed like an afterthought, something done almost by accident, an instinctive move to share what was left. But the civilians who had been watching couldn't ignore what it represented. Here was a soldier, one of the very people who had been part of the machine of war, offering what little food he had without condition, without hesitation, and most remarkably, without the expectation of anything in return. There was a stunned silence among the civilians who had been observing from their hidden positions. The act itself was so ordinary in its simplicity, yet the implications of it resonated far beyond what any of them had been prepared for. For years, they had learned to associate soldiers with control, with scarcity, and with cruelty. Even the idea of receiving aid or sustenance from them had never entered their minds. But here, in this small, almost casual gesture, the balance of power seemed to shift, however subtly. The civilian who had been offered the bread hesitated, just for a moment. He stood frozen, uncertain whether to accept or refuse. His instincts told him that such an offer, especially one made by a soldier, carried risks he could not yet fully comprehend. In the past, such actions had always come with strings attached. Food might be offered, but it was never without a price. There were always conditions, always the implicit threat that accepting the food could be a tacit submission to authority. But this time, there were no strings. There was no price to be paid, no further transaction demanded. The soldiers simply offered the bread, not as a tool of control, but as an act of kindness or, at the very least, an acknowledgement of shared humanity. For a long moment, the civilian stood there, caught between disbelief and the urge to reach out and accept what was being offered. What if this was a trap? What if taking the bread meant something he couldn't yet understand? But there were no signs of malice in the soldier's expression, no hidden agenda. The soldier simply waited, his gaze calm and neutral, giving the civilian a choice. Finally, the civilian extended his hand. The gesture was tentative at first, but it gained strength as he realized that this was not an act of coercion. It was an offer, simple and clear, and in that moment, the walls that had kept these two groups, soldiers and civilians, so rigidly apart began to dissolve. As the bread was passed, both the civilian and the soldier seemed to acknowledge, without speaking, that this small act marked the beginning of something bigger than either of them had anticipated. What followed was more significant than the bread itself. The civilians, watching from their places of hiding, began to understand that the soldiers were not merely fulfilling a duty, nor were they just taking what was necessary for survival. They were offering a part of themselves, in a way that had been unthinkable only hours before. The soldiers were not just consuming food, they were sharing it, without fear, without suspicion, without any obvious motive other than the simple recognition that others were hungry too. This moment was an anomaly in a world where hunger had been weaponized, and where generosity was a rare and dangerous thing. As the civilians began to process this unexpected act, something deeper began to shift within them. They had lived in a world where deprivation was not just physical but emotional. Hunger, for them, had not been merely an absence of food, it had been a reminder of their powerlessness, a symbol of their place in a world that had long forgotten their needs. To witness this exchange, this simple act of food being shared without expectation of anything in return, disrupted that deeply ingrained belief system. It was not that they had been waiting for a savior, nor that they expected the soldiers to solve all their problems. But this moment, this simple exchange, gave them a glimpse into a different kind of world, a world where power was not automatically assumed by those with food, where hunger did not always dictate behavior, where empathy could still exist amid conflict. It was difficult for the civilians to fully accept this new reality, even as it unfolded before them. They had been trained to expect the worst from everyone, especially from those in power. And yet here was proof that things could be different, proof that the rules governing war, survival, and scarcity could be bent, could be challenged. The soldiers were still soldiers. They had not shed their uniforms, nor had they relinquished their status as occupying forces. But in this one act, they had blurred the lines between soldier and civilian, between conqueror and conquered. The civilians, in turn, began to see them not just as an occupying force, but as men who could be capable of something more than rigid obedience to orders. As the bread passed, it wasn't just food that was exchanged, it was something far more subtle, something far more profound. It was the recognition that survival did not always have to come at the cost of one's humanity. It was the acknowledgement that even in the darkest times, there could still be room for compassion, for kindness, for shared connection. And it was the realization for the civilians that they were not powerless in every situation, that they still had the capacity to effect change, to open the door to new possibilities, even in the smallest of ways. The soldiers, for their part, seemed oblivious to the weight of their actions. They continued eating and sharing without any sense of ceremony, as if it were simply the most natural thing in the world. But for the civilians watching, it was anything but ordinary. It was a moment of reckoning, a brief but powerful glimpse into a different world, one where empathy was possible even amid the most brutal conditions. As the soldiers finished their meal and prepared to move on, the civilians stood rooted to their spots, still processing what they had just witnessed. The bread had been passed, but the emotional impact of that simple act would linger long after the soldiers had gone. The civilians were left with a new understanding, one that would take time to fully absorb. They had learned, in that brief exchange, that hunger did not have to be their defining experience. And perhaps, just perhaps, they could begin to imagine a world where survival did not require the erosion of their humanity. The soldiers, in their quiet, unassuming way, had shown them that it was possible. And that knowledge, fragile and still nascent, would change everything. As the days passed, the scene from the previous afternoon remained firmly etched in the minds of those who had witnessed it. What had begun as a small, almost accidental act of kindness had now settled into a kind of quiet, lingering tension. The civilians, who had watched from behind broken walls and dilapidated buildings, had found themselves in a strange place emotionally, caught between the unexpected hope that had bloomed in their hearts and the well-worn caution of years spent surviving in a world that had shown them only hardship and scarcity. The soldiers, meanwhile, had not changed. They carried on as they always had, moving through their routines, never acknowledging the significance of their actions. To them, this was simply how things were done, a matter of course, a habit. But for the civilians, it was something entirely different, something that would not easily be forgotten or dismissed. The soldiers' behavior was now being observed more closely than ever before. Every meal, every interaction, was analyzed with an intensity that was both painful and necessary. It was this consistency that began to wear away at the walls the civilians had built around their hearts. At first, they had refused to believe it. The offer of food could not be an act of kindness without ulterior motives. It could not be real because the world they lived in had taught them that kindness in such a context was a rare, fleeting thing, often used to manipulate or control. But with each passing day, it became harder to deny what was unfolding before them. The soldiers had no expectation of anything in return. They shared because they could, because it was possible, because the simple act of offering food had become as natural to them as eating it. And it was this simplicity that began to change everything. The civilians, still hesitant, began to gather in larger numbers near the edges of the soldiers' camp. They did not approach directly, but they no longer hid as they had before. They stood at a distance, their eyes fixed on the soldiers, watching as they ate and shared, their minds working overtime to understand what was happening. The hunger they felt was no longer just a physical ache. It had become an emotional and psychological burden. It was not only their bodies that had been starved by war, but their souls, starved of kindness, of connection, of trust. And now, here was this strange, almost inexplicable act of generosity, slowly filling that empty space, offering a glimpse of something they had long thought lost forever. Still, even as hope began to stir, the civilians could not completely silence the voice of doubt that had been ingrained in them for so long. They had been taught, over and over, that survival was a matter of self-preservation, of securing enough for oneself before anyone else. And yet, here were these soldiers, occupiers, invaders, enemies, sharing their food as though they had no need to cling to it, as though the world could still be a place where sharing was not a threat. The civilians' minds reeled at the possibility. They had learned to expect betrayal, not kindness. They had been trained to believe that nothing in this world was ever truly free, that every kindness came with a price. But these soldiers, with their quiet generosity, were proving them wrong, one small act at a time. In time, more and more civilians began to approach. They came in small groups at first, hesitant and uncertain, but they no longer kept their distance. They stood just beyond the soldiers' reach, watching as they ate, waiting for the moment when the soldiers would offer food once again. And then, when it came, they accepted it, tentatively at first, but with growing confidence. The soldiers did not question them, did not demand anything in return. They simply offered what they had, and the civilians took it, not with the desperation they had once felt, but with a quiet understanding that something had shifted between them. In this moment, the rules had changed. The boundaries that had once divided them, soldier and civilian, conqueror and conquered, began to blur, and with that blurring came the realization that they were no longer separate. For the civilians, the acceptance of the food was not just about satisfying hunger, it was about something much deeper. It was about reclaiming a part of themselves that had been lost in the relentless grind of survival. For so long, they had been nothing but victims of circumstance, struggling to endure the unrelenting weight of deprivation. They had learned to suppress their emotions, to deny their own needs in order to survive. But now, as they stood in front of the soldiers, receiving food without fear or hesitation, they began to remember what it felt like to be seen as human, to be treated with respect, to be offered something simply because they were in need. The food, in that moment, became a symbol of something much more powerful than sustenance. It became a symbol of their shared humanity. But even as they accepted the food, the civilians could not entirely silence their doubts. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface. What would happen once the food ran out? Would the soldiers go back to being the distant, cold figures they had once been? Would the kindness they had shown be forgotten, replaced by the harsh realities of occupation and war? These questions haunted them as they ate, as they stood there with their hands stretched out, accepting what they had once thought was impossible. And yet, despite these fears, something else began to take root. With each passing day, as the soldiers continued to share their food, the civilians began to understand that this was not a fleeting act, that the soldiers were not simply indulging in a moment of weakness or guilt. This was something deeper, something that had been awakened by the very act of giving. The soldiers, in their quiet, unassuming way, had shown the civilians that there was another path, another way to exist in the world, even in the midst of war and suffering. They had demonstrated that it was possible to live with compassion, to share what you had even when you had so little yourself, to recognize the humanity in others, even when it seemed that everything around you was designed to strip away that very humanity. The realization came slowly, but it was profound. The civilians began to see that they had a choice, that they were not bound by the rules of scarcity and survival that had governed their lives for so long. They could choose to accept the kindness being offered, to accept the food without fear, without guilt. They could choose to believe that something more was possible, even in the most difficult of times. And in that choice, they found a kind of freedom, not freedom from hunger, but freedom from the emotional and psychological chains that had kept them trapped in a world of suspicion and despair. The soldiers, for their part, seemed unaware of the impact they were having. They continued their routines, offering food without fanfare, without expecting anything in return. But in their quiet, unacknowledged way, they had changed the lives of those who had been watching, those who had received. They had shown them that, even in the darkest of times, there could still be moments of light, moments when humanity was not measured by what one had, but by what one was willing to give.